Undercover CEO books a meal at his buffet, freezes as he hears an employee ridiculing a hungry man. He walked in as a nobody, but left as the undercover CEO who changed everything. Under the flickering neon lights of store number 13, a man quietly pulled his cap low, his rough hands gripping a buffet ticket purchased anonymously through an app. To any passerby, he seemed like just another ordinary customer, dressed in a worn-out hoodie and faded sneakers. But no one knew that behind that simple disguise stood Miles Donovan, 50 years old, CEO and founder of the buffet chain, once hailed as where a meal meets kindness. Recently, the sales numbers from this store had left Miles restless. There were no major complaints, but everything felt unsettlingly quiet. Mediocre revenue, average reviews, nothing terrible, yet nothing good enough. It was the kind of eerie silence that seasoned business veterans like him recognized all too well, a clear sign that the company's culture was quietly falling apart before anyone noticed. The automatic doors slid shut behind him. The lingering smell of old frying oil clung to the air, cutting through the dim light cast by the ceiling lamps. Miles slowly made his way toward the service counter, his eyes scanning every detail from the cracks in the tiled floor to the slouched posture of a staff member standing beside a tray of cold, greasy fried chicken. Everything was neat, but missing something. That special ingredient he had sworn to preserve, the warmth of human connection. Then, a sharp, cold voice cut through the air. "This isn't a soup kitchen. You want to eat, you pay." Miles froze. That wasn't how anyone in his organization should ever treat a person, whether they were a paying customer or homeless. He knew immediately tonight's story wouldn't end with just a meal. It would mark the beginning of a deeper investigation. And this time, the undercover boss wouldn't be leaving quietly. In the dim lighting of the buffet line, Miles Donovan stood frozen, his blood running cold. "You think this is a charity? Pay up or move along, stop bothering the customers." The sharp, bitter words of Eric, the hot food counter staff, echoed like a slap across the already somber room. Behind the sneeze guard, a weary-looking man in a tattered coat stood silently, his hands cracked from the biting cold. He didn't beg. He didn't complain. He just stood there, head bowed, his eyes long since accustomed to contempt. Miles clenched his fists, his knuckles turning white. After all these years building this buffet chain, he had promised himself, this is not just a place to serve meals, it's a place to restore compassion. And yet today, right under his own brand name, that kindness had been ripped apart by cruel words. But then, in that moment of darkness, a small, blinding light appeared. Whitney, a young girl working at the salad bar, stepped forward quietly. No grand gesture, no attention drawn. She swiftly scooped a small meal, placed it gently on a battered tray, and with the softest of voices, handed it to the man. "Here you go, sir, but please try not to let anyone see." Without fanfare, without waiting for a thank you, that was exactly what Miles had feared for months. The culture of the company he had once built was fracturing, but even so, there were still people like Whitney keeping the flame of conscience alive. Miles turned and quickly walked out into the cold. The biting wind lashed his face, but it couldn't quell the fire burning inside his chest. He pulled out his phone and dialed the regional manager directly. His voice was low but tense, each word sharp as a blade. "Tomorrow morning, 8 a.m., store number 13. I'm coming back personally. And this time, they'll know exactly who I am." He snapped the phone shut with a loud click, a sound that felt like a declaration of war. The undercover boss had officially returned. And this time, it wasn't just to observe, it was to fix the rot at its very core. The atmosphere at store number 13 the next morning was colder and heavier than even the harsh winter air outside. Miles Donovan walked through the worn staff entrance, using the old access card he'd kept from the company's earliest days. His seasoned eyes swept over the scene before him. The dishwasher rattled endlessly in the background. At the kitchen station, a young man worked hunched over, occasionally reaching down to rub his left knee, his pale face barely masking the pain. That was Matteo, a kitchen hand wearing a grease-stained apron and shoes so worn out the toe caps were nearly torn through. Miles stepped closer, his gaze calm but piercing. "You've been working since this morning, haven't you?" he asked, his voice low but cutting. Startled, Matteo straightened his posture, trying to stand taller. "Yes, sir. Someone called out sick this morning. I'm fine, really." But his limping leg told the truth his words tried to hide. Matteo was pushing through the pain simply because he was afraid someone else would have to shoulder his workload. At the front of the house, Nathy's store manager was nowhere to be seen. The manager's office lights were dim, the door shut tight since morning. Meanwhile, Eric lounged against the buffet counter, thumbing through his phone without a care, occasionally casting his eyes across the floor like some self-appointed king. One sharp glance from him was enough to make the staff shrink away in silence. Toxicity hung heavy in the air. The employees worked like shadows, moving quietly, avoiding eye contact. No one smiled, no one dared offer extra help to a customer for fear of being corrected by Eric. A few regulars walked in, took one look, and quietly left without ordering a thing. Only Whitney remained like a hidden spring running through the wasteland, still patient, still kind with every customer. She quietly gathered up the scattered pieces of humanity left in this place, preserving little acts of kindness in a space that seemed to have forgotten warmth entirely. Miles stood silently, watching as Whitney quietly wiped away a coffee stain left on the table without anyone asking her to. He allowed himself a small, meaningful smile. Beneath this layer of apathy, there were still people willing to keep the flame alive, even when it seemed all but extinguished. He pulled out his phone and dialed the regional manager directly, his voice cold and sharp like a blade freshly drawn from its sheath. "Are you aware of how store number 13 is being run? If not, come here immediately and see it with your own eyes. From now on, I'm done reading reports on paper. I want to see real action." He hung up the phone, his fist tightening. At this moment, it wasn't just disappointment that filled his heart, but a burning drive for change. He was back. And this time, the undercover boss wasn't just watching. He was here to act. Miles walked slowly through the kitchen aisles, every step seeming to thicken the already oppressive atmosphere. The smell of old grease, the faint stench of something burnt from an unclean stove, and the harsh scent of cheap air freshener all blended into a suffocating mix. In the corner, Mateo was hunched over, struggling to prepare the last tray of vegetables for the lunch rush. His knuckles had turned white, his hands trembling as he tried to hold the knife steady. Miles tilted his head slightly, his sharp gaze seeming to cut right through the young man's thin, exhausted frame. "Have you ever thought about taking a break?" Miles asked, his voice calm but cutting through the room like a razor. "With that leg of yours, do you realize how close you are to a serious injury?" Mateo froze, his face pale with panic. I just don't want the others to have to work extra shifts, and if I don't work, I probably won't have enough for rent by the end of the month." His voice trailed off, eyes downcast. He tried to hide the familiar helplessness of a young man being slowly crushed by life. Miles slowly placed a firm, reassuring hand on Mateo's shoulder. His grip was steady, both a gesture of comfort and a silent promise. "You just focus on doing your best. I'll take care of the rest." Out in the main dining area, Whitney was quietly directing the staff, her leadership subtle but unmistakable. Though she didn't hold an official managerial title, everyone naturally followed her lead. A young girl accidentally dropped a tray of drinks. Before anyone could scold her, Whitney stepped forward, bent down, and cleaned it up herself. From where he stood by the large window, Miles could clearly see the gratitude and relief in the young girl's eyes, as Whitney gently patted her shoulder and softly reassured her. "It's okay. Everyone fumbles sometimes. Just be more careful next time, all right?" From afar, Eric continued to taunt the group of new employees. "If you can work, then work. If not, get out of the way. I'm not here to pay salaries to idle hands and lazy feet." So, Eric's half-hearted laugh echoed through the space, laced with his false sense of authority. The staff could only bow their heads in silence. The tension in the air felt like a tightly wound string, ready to snap at any second. Miles clenched his jaw. His hand tightened around his phone, veins bulging visibly on his weathered skin. Without hesitation, he turned sharply and marched toward the manager's office, pushing the door open forcefully. Inside, Nathy, a person entrusted with managing this store, sat comfortably with a cup of coffee, a pile of unresolved paperwork scattered before her. "Do you not see how your employees out there are being crushed under the weight of a man like Eric? Or is this the kind of toxic culture you're content to let fester?" Miles's voice boomed low and deep, like thunder held back before a coming storm. Christina startled, dropping her pen in panic, stammering, I did hear some things, but Eric handles the shift pressures well. I'm short-staffed, and he can manage the workload, so..." Miles waved her excuses away, cutting her off mid-sentence. "Then let me show you what real pressure looks like. I want every employee gathered in the main hall, right now." 15 minutes later, the entire staff had assembled in the main hall. Eric arrived last, his usual lazy swagger intact, hands buried in his pockets, a defiant smirk playing at the corners of his mouth. Miles didn't stand on a stage. He didn't need a microphone, yet his voice rang out, clear and commanding. I am Miles Donovan. I'm the founder of this buffet chain. And yesterday, I stood right here in this restaurant and personally witnessed one of my employees, Eric, insult a man who only wanted a bit of leftover food. Silence fell like a heavy curtain. Eric froze, his face draining of color as whispers began to ripple through the gathered crowd. But right here as well, I saw kindness still quietly held by some like Miss Whitney here. And I know this, to pull a sinking place back from chaos, I don't need people who talk well. I need people who do the right thing. Miles pulled out his phone and pressed a quick dial button. Moments later, the regional manager and a senior HR representative entered the hall. Miles turned back to Christina, his gaze unwavering. You have 24 hours to hand me a full plan for this store's reform. If you don't, someone else will take your place. His eyes softened as they landed on Whitney. You are hereby promoted to shift supervisor, effective immediately. I expect real change to start with people who have a heart like yours. Then turning to Eric, Miles coldly delivered the final blow. And you, Eric, can leave right now. That cheap power you're clinging to ends here. Eric threw his staff badge onto the counter and quietly walked out under the contemptuous stares of his colleagues. Miles Donovan stood tall, his eyes gazing through the large glass window. Outside, the dull winter sky suddenly cracked open, a thin beam of sunlight piercing through the thick clouds. He knew this reform had only just begun, but the fire of human decency had been rekindled, and this time, it would burn brighter than ever before. In the dimly lit meeting room of store number 13, the flickering light seemed to reflect the exhausted morale of the entire staff. The chairs were haphazardly arranged, no tables, no preparations for any formal meeting. But today, none of them knew they were about to witness a historic moment, the day when everything that had sagged under neglect would be set right. Wesley Morgan, dressed simply but with eyes sharp and clear, stood before the entire staff. He didn't need a microphone or a thick report. Silence hung heavy, like the oppressive air before a storm. Do you know who I am? He spoke, his low voice echoing clearly through the cramped room. There were a few shy glances exchanged. Whitney stood quietly at the back, her gaze fixed on him. Eric leaned casually against the wall, arms crossed, a smug smirk playing on his lips, as if he were just watching a meaningless play. I'm the one who built this chain from nothing. From days when I had to wash every tray with my own hands and scrub every inch of the kitchen floor. And yesterday, Wesley paused, his eyes cutting straight into Eric, I saw firsthand the kind of toxic culture you've allowed to grow here. He turned to Christina, the manager. You call this management? Letting someone like Eric decide who deserves respect and who doesn't? Eric let out a mocking laugh, but before he could say anything, Wesley raised a hand to silence him. Eric, you don't need to say another word. As of this moment, you are no longer part of this company. Go pack your things. The room erupted in shock. Some exhaled long-held sighs of relief. Whitney stood frozen, her eyes welling up with emotion. Eric's face turned pale. Mr. Morgan, you can't just do this. You've done plenty already. Wesley's voice was unwavering. It's your arrogance and lack of compassion that drove our customers away and crushed the spirits of your fellow workers. I'm not firing you for just one moment yesterday, Eric. I'm firing you for the toxic culture you've been spreading here all this time. No one stood up to defend Eric. Not even Christina, who kept her head low, unable to utter a single word. Wesley turned around, his gaze softening as he looked toward Whitney. There is someone here, though not in a management role, who already has the qualities we need. Whitney, I officially appoint you as head of service, starting today. You deserve respect and the authority to improve this place. Whitney stood frozen, stunned. It took her a moment before she could softly reply, Thank you, sir, but I only did what was right. And that alone is enough to make you a leader, Wesley smiled. I want every employee here to remember this clearly. Whoever does not respect customers or colleagues has no place at Maggie's place. The ticking of the clock seemed to emphasize the finality of his words. But Wesley wasn't done yet. He unbuttoned his sleeves and rolled them up. One more thing, where's Mateo? Mateo, the young cook with a tightly wrapped bandage on his knees slowly, stepped forward, his face full of surprise. You take the day off, son. Go home and rest. Today, I'll handle the kitchen, Wesley declared without hesitation, striding straight into the kitchen like a seasoned chef. No one could believe their ISA CEO willing to work the line, flipping each cut of meat, wiping every spill on the greasy floor. But for Wesley, this wasn't just an empty promise. He wanted his team to witness it firsthand. A true leader doesn't just stand above and give orders, but knows how to bend down, work alongside, and truly understand those under his care. As the delicious aroma of grilled meat wafted from the kitchen, the tension that had gripped the meeting room had long since melted away. Change had already begun from that very kitchen, from the founder's hands that hadn't been seen on the front line in ages. In the conference room, silence reigned. The old neon lights flickered faintly overhead, and the ticking of the wall clock echoed loudly in the thick air of tension. Wesley Morgano, longer the man hidden beneath a faded hoodie the day before, stepped into the room in a simple but sharp suit. He stood tall, his eyes cold and sharp, sweeping across the room full of lowered heads. Only Eric leaned casually against the wall, arms crossed, his eyes filled with defiance. "Do you know who I am?" Wesley's voice wasn't loud, but it rang out with undeniable authority. No one answered. Only Whitney quietly lifted her head, a glimmer of hope in her eyes. Mateo, his knee still bandaged, straightened his apron and stood upright, despite the lingering pain. Wesley sighed deeply, then locked eyes with Eric. "Eric Thompson, as of this moment, you are no longer a part of this organization. Leave immediately." The room buzzed like a rising wave. Eric sneered, pushing off the wall and striding forward. "Are you serious?" he scoffed. "I'm the one holding this place together, Morgan. Who do you think can fill my shoes?" Wesley stood motionless, his eyes unblinking. "I don't need anyone holding the place together by humiliating customers and trampling on people's dignity. What we've built here is not a place where someone like you gets to decide who deserves to be treated like a human being." End of 4. He stepped closer, grabbed the employee badge hanging from Eric's neck, and yanked it off. The cold, sharp clang of the badge hitting the table echoed through the room. "This is the last time you walk through that door." Eric's fists clenched in anger, his eyes darting around the room, but no one stood with him. Whitney's eyes gleamed with quiet defiance. Mateo stood silently at her side, and all the other employees, those who once bowed their heads in submission now, lifted them high. Eric realized he had lost. He stormed out, the door slamming against the wall with a heavy finality. The room settled. Wesley slowly turned back, his eyes softer now. "This isn't the end," he said, his deep, warm voice filling the space. "Today, we start over. And I'm not just going to stand here and talk. I'll be right there with you cooking, washing dishes, carrying trays. If anyone wants to see what leadership really looks like, it starts now." Whitney's lips parted slightly in surprise, then formed the faintest smile. She never imagined a day would come when the person at the top would don an apron and stand shoulder to shoulder with them on the front line. "Whitney," Wesley called, "from today, you are officially the head of service. You've shown the most important qualities we value: compassion and courage." Whitney couldn't even find the words. She simply nodded, her eyes glistening with emotion. "Mateo," Wesley continued, turning to the young chef, "you've rested enough. Starting tomorrow, you'll only handle light tasks, and we'll support your full recovery. But after that, I want you to enter our internal leadership training program. You've got what it takes, don't waste it." Mateo stared at him in disbelief before clenching his jaw and nodding firmly. I won't let you down." Without hesitation, Wesley took off his tie, rolled up his sleeves, and threw on an apron. He walked straight into the kitchen, slipped on gloves, and took the spatula from Mateo's hands. "I'll handle lunch today. Someone let the customers know there's a very special chef behind the counter." Laughter rippled through the room, and the heavy air of tension lifted instantly. Staff moved quickly, their faces lighter. From that moment on, they all knew things had truly changed. Late in the afternoon, as the last rays of sunlight filtered through the faded curtains, Wesley Morgan stepped out of the temporary office that Christina had handed over. In his hands was the finalized personnel restructuring plan, completed after hours of careful review. He stood before the entire team, his warm, steady voice resonating with undeniable firmness. "Starting today, there will be no more cases of one person covering 3 or 4 shifts, or silently enduring just to keep their job. I don't want people standing here out of fear of being fired. I want people to stay because they believe this place can become better." Christina, the store manager, lowered her head quietly. Throughout the meeting, she didn't offer the usual justifications, but simply listened in silence. Wesley glanced at her. His gaze held no blame but left no room for excuses. "Christina," he addressed her directly, "you have 90 days to prove that you can become the leader this team needs. Not someone who just handles timesheets and pretty reports, but someone willing to stand with them through the hardest times. If you can't," he left the sentence hanging, but his look said it all. That very afternoon, Wesley asked Christina to personally help him reorganize the work schedule for each employee. 12-hour shifts were eliminated, and a new schedule of 2 working days followed by 1 rest day was reinstated. "We don't want another Mateo," he said, his eyes resting on the young chef who was still trying to hide the bandage on his knee behind the kitchen counter. By evening, when the clinking of plates and dishes had faded, Wesley sat down with Whitney and Mateo, two employees he placed great hope in. "Whitney," he began slowly but with weight in his words, "you didn't just save the image of this store that day. You saved the hope that this could be a place where kindness isn't seen as weakness. I want you to start the new employee training program next week. Teach them not just how to serve, but more importantly, how to treat people with respect." For perhaps the first time in her life, Whitney fell silent with emotion. She nodded gently, her eyes brimming with tears but shining bright with hope. Wesley turned to Mateo. "Have you ever thought about becoming a mentor?" Mateo chuckled softly, his voice hoarse with emotion. "Honestly, never, Mr. Morgan. I didn't even think I'd make it through this winter." "Well, start getting used to the idea," Wesley smiled. "When that knee heals, I want to see you in the role of assistant head chef. And remember, it's not enough to just cook well. Teach others to cook with their hearts." That day, Wesley didn't go home right away. He rolled up his sleeves and stood right there in the kitchen, where Mateo usually toiled away. Under the kitchen lights, the founder of a famous buffet chain didn't hesitate to pick up a knife and start sorting vegetables, checking the quality of every ingredient. He pointed to a pile of greens, still mixed with wilted leaves, and turned to a newly hired kitchen assistant. "Do you know why you have to pick through each leaf like this?" The young man shook his head awkwardly. "Because even for a simple meal, people deserve the best. And also, that's how the cook never forgets who they're really cooking for." No grand slogans were needed. No long, flowery speeches. With just one small action, Wesley showed the entire team one critical lesson. If you want others to change, the leader must lead by example first. The old neon light hanging in front of the store was finally repaired, now glowing brightly and steadily after months of flickering. Standing before the freshly cleaned sign, Wesley Morgan smiled knowingly. His eyes scanned over both familiar and unfamiliar faces inside, where the atmosphere seemed to have shifted remarkably in just a few short days. That afternoon staff meeting, Wesley entered the small conference room and let his gaze linger on each person's face. Gone were the averted eyes and forced smiles. The air had changed, perhaps not drastically yet, but enough for him to feel it. Wesley placed the restructuring plan on the table, his voice firm and unwavering. "Today, we're not talking about sales. We're not discussing profit margins. We're talking about people. If anyone here still believes that keeping staff through fear and pressure is the best way, you may stand up and leave this room right now." The entire room fell silent. "We will end this exhausting work culture immediately. From today, those excessively long shifts are canceled. No one will work more than 8 hours a day without a justifiable reason and their full consent." Christina pressed her lips tightly together. She knew this declaration meant all those gap-filling staffing plans she had relied on would have to be completely scrapped. But this time, she didn't object. She simply asked quietly, "And if I can't find enough qualified people in time, Mr. Morgan?" Wesley smirked. "Then you will be the one stepping into that position. A true leader knows how to carry the burden first." The very next day, an internal recruitment interview session was held directly at the restaurant, a stark contrast to the rushed, careless hiring processes of the past. Wesley himself sat at the interview table. There were no standardized questionnaires, no generic experience-based inquiries that anyone could memorize. He asked just one simple question. "If a poor person walked into this restaurant without enough money for a meal, what would you do?" Some laughed awkwardly, others were too flustered to answer. But when Whitney walked in, she didn't have to think too long. "If the restaurant still has leftover food, I'll ask for my manager's permission to help them. And if there's none left, I'll invite them to come back during my shift to make sure they don't have to leave empty-handed." Wesley looked straight into her sincere eyes and smiled. Never let those values fade away again. Mateo was called separately into the kitchen by Wesley. Contrary to the young man's worries, Wesley didn't scold him. Instead, he made an unexpected offer. "Would you like to take on the role of mentoring the new kitchen staff?" Mateo's eyes widened. "But my knee is still bandaged. How could I possibly?" Wesley raised his hand to stop him. "Being a teacher doesn't mean you always have to be on your feet, working nonstop in the kitchen. A great mentor is someone who knows how to pass on experience and protect the next generation from the mistakes they once made. You can start by teaching them how to work properly without harming themselves, the way you had to learn through hardship." Mateo bowed his head, feeling for the first time that his quiet voice now carried real weight. At the end of the night shift, before all the staff, Wesley suddenly rolled up his sleeves and took the position of cleaning the dishwashing station, task usually left to the newest or least respected employees. No one here is too important to pick up a broom, and no one is too small to become a leader, Wesley said with a warm smile, as soft murmurs of admiration spread behind him. Christina stood beside Whitney. For the first time in many months, she exhaled deeply and allowed herself a genuine, relaxed smile. She whispered to Whitney, "I finally understand. Being a leader isn't about commanding from afar, but about standing beside others when the work is at its worst." Whitney nodded gently. "And to remind people that amidst the piles of dirty dishes, the cleanest values can always be found." The night sky glowed a pure, serene shade of blue. The first breezes of the season gently swept through, carrying that crisp, familiar chill, but it felt somehow comforting. In front of store number 13, the neon sign had been completely replaced, shining brightly now, no longer flickering weakly in the dark. The lights shone as if reigniting a long-forgotten aspiration, the dream of a place that didn't just serve meals, but also served the most fundamental values of humanity. Wesley Morgan stood before the entrance, soft light reflecting off his peaceful smile. He turned back, glancing through the thick glass. Inside, there were no more scenes of laziness, hidden phones beneath counters, or indifferent eyes toward customers. Now, every movement carried a sense of ownership and pride. If a company wants to grow, it must do so with wide-open eyes, hands ready to work, and a heart full of empathy. Oh, these words weren't framed on a wall or printed in an employee handbook. They were etched into every small action. Whitney, now in her new uniform with a nameplate proudly engraved "Lead Server," was guiding a new staff member on how to prepare a perfect glass of lemonade balancing sweet and sour just right. "Just like how we treat people," she explained, gentle but never unclear. Mateo, though his knee was still lightly bandaged, wore a bright, genuine smile. He stood at the food prep station, patiently showing a new employee how to plate dishes beautifully, saying, "When a meal is treated with care, the person eating it feels respected." And even Christina, who once hid away in her office, was now standing by the checkout counter, bowing slightly with a sincere smile, as she greeted each guest, no longer offering empty nods of politeness. In that moment, Wesley knew he didn't need to stand on a podium or send out long-winded memos. The lesson of kindness, of responsibility, of simply being human, had already taken root in this place. Outside, a little boy held his mother's hand, gazing up at the newly restored sign. He squealed excitedly, "Mom, the lights are on again. Maybe we'll get cake here tonight." The mother smiled and squeezed his tiny hand. "Yes, sweetheart, I think tonight will be different." Wesley stood quietly, his eyes suddenly glimmering. He understood that these changes might be small, but like stones cast into a still pond, they would ripple far and wide. And amidst that scene, he thought to himself, corporate culture doesn't live in lofty slogans hanging on walls. It exists in the quiet moments when people help each other without anyone noticing. In the moment, a staff member dries a wet floor so an elderly guest won't slip. In how leftover meals are carefully packed and handed over without a trace of pity in their eyes. And the neon sign shone brightly, no longer flickering. Once lit, it stays lit forever, rekindling hope. A store can change its paint, replace its signage, but only when its heart is reignited can it truly be called home.